Alright, so yesterday we covered the circulatory system. Today we are going to cover the respiratory system. This will be the last of the three systems. So we've taken a look at the digestive, circulatory. Today we're going to finish off with the respiratory. Please don't forget, we will be having your test next Friday and dissection next Thursday. So let's take a look at the respiratory system. Okay, big thing here, respiratory system is obviously responsible for helping us breathe, which means it's responsible for taking the oxygen from the air and exchanging it for all the carbon dioxide that our cells produce. So remember, our muscles need oxygen in order to function. So we're taking in all this oxygen from the outside, and when our muscles work hard, they're producing carbon dioxide, all the waste that we need to get rid of. So we learned in the circulatory system, we have our capillary sites, which are responsible for some of that gas exchange. And that kind of works in tandem with our respiratory system. So these two systems are really connected to each other, and they really couldn't function without one another at all. So it's very, very important that these two systems work in tandem to accomplish the goal of this gas exchange. So we're going to take a look at kind of a step-by-step way of how this happens. On your tests and your quizzes, I'm going to expect you to know the pathway of a breath of air, which means that you should be expected to know that obviously you take a breath through your nose or through your mouth. So it starts off in your nasal cavity, goes through your pharynx, your epiglottis. You need to know this pathway. You don't really need to know all of these descriptions, but you do need to know this path. That's something that I'm going to ask you on practice quizzes, on your worksheets for homework, certainly on your test and on your exam as well. Okay, so please just make a note of that on this slide. Okay, we've talked about photosynthesis in this course. The opposite of that is cellular respiration. So these two things are considered complementary processes. You'll notice that the chemical equations for both are completely flipped around. So photosynthesis, the products were oxygen and glucose. In cellular respiration, those products are actually the reactants. So when we breathe, we require oxygen to breathe, and obviously breathing requires some energy from us. So we take the oxygen and our energy, we turn that into carbon dioxide, which is something you inhale, that waste. And you'll probably have noticed that if you've ever fogged up a mirror by breathing on it, you're actually giving off some water vapor. So we also give off some water and then the energy that we use. This process always occurs in our mitochondria. So in every cell, remember mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, it's the site of ATP synthesis, which is energy production. That's where cellular respiration occurs. Okay, when you breathe in, that's called inhalation. And when you breathe in, you often take a deep breath. So you're taking in air, which means we need to clear some space for that oxygen in order to get into your body. So we have this thing called the diaphragm, which is like basically right below your lungs and kind of keeps them in place. When you breathe in, your diaphragm actually slides down in order to allow your lungs to expand even more, which allows you to take a bigger breath in. So if you took a big deep breath, your diaphragm would drop lower. Now, when you breathe out, we're getting rid of the air in our lungs, so we're pushing it out. So now instead of our diaphragm moving down, if you take a look over here, our diaphragm moves up, and that pushes out all of the air that was in our lungs out through our mouth. So when we're inhaling, our diaphragm moves down, gives us some more space, allows us to take a deeper breath. When we exhale, our diaphragm moves up and pushes that air out of our mouth. Okay, so I said we're going to need to know the pathway. This is basically how it works. So you take a deep breath and air goes in through your nose and then through the pharynx and then right into your trachea. So I'm just going to flip back real quick just to show you how this goes down. So through your nose, your pharynx, and your trachea, which is right down here. So you'll notice the esophagus is over here, your trachea is over here. So those two things don't really overlap. Which is why they say like, oh, if you ever like choke on food, that means food went down the wrong hole. And that actually does sometimes happen because you'll see that those two things almost are connected right here. But the esophagus and trachea are certainly different, but food really can go down the wrong hole because those two things kind of overlap right here. Anyway, So we start with the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the trachea, and then it kind of branches out into our lungs, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, give me a sec to copy that down. All right, after you take a breath, goes through the pharynx, goes through the trachea, and then you remember maybe from before there was that thing called the epiglottis. That's kind of like the valves in the circulatory system where we block things from moving. So we block the black flow of blood. The epiglottis makes sure that air can pass in the trachea and then doesn't let food into the trachea. Now, obviously, that's not a perfect system because sometimes you swallow down the wrong hole. You got to choke it up. That's because your epiglottis wasn't functioning properly. But the epiglottis is pretty good, which is why you don't often choke on food. It's the thing that makes sure only air goes down your trachea. Now, from the trachea, air will keep going down and passes into these bronchi. These things kind of branch out into even smaller tubes, and those are called the bronchioles. And then from there, after we hit the bronchioles, we go right into these tiny sacs, and these things are the key. So these are the alveoli. And the alveoli, or alveoli, is where we have all of our gas exchange happening. So these are the major key of this entire system. So it's a little bit less steps than the digestive system. So once again, nasal passage, pharynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli. So it's really only 6. The epiglottis is kind of like that accessory organ in the digestive system. Air doesn't really pass through it, but it has a very important function. Okay, we talked a lot about gas exchange yesterday, which is why I normally do these 2 lessons together. But just so you don't forget, arteries are going to be carrying that oxygenated blood. They'll deliver oxygen to all the muscles, and then as they deliver the oxygen, they're going to take out that carbon dioxide and move that deoxygenated blood, so they don't have any oxygen, they just have carbon dioxide, through the veins. Red blood cells, you've probably heard of this protein called hemoglobin, and those are found in our red blood cells. So as this sentence right here says, maybe a good thing to highlight, when deoxygenated red blood cells pass through the alveoli, and remember that's the site of that gas exchange, it's the hemoglobin which allows them to pick up oxygen, which is pretty important. So that's what hemoglobin does. It's responsible for attaching to those oxygen molecules. Okay, and this is what we were talking about a lot yesterday in terms of the capillary being that site where we connect our arteries to our veins, and that's where our gas exchange happens. So that's a very, very important piece. This paints a really good picture of what we were talking about. Our nasal cavity connecting to our windpipe or our trachea branches out into the bronchi, then to our bronchioles, and then to our alveoli. So there's these very, very small sacs where it can happen for us. Remember, the whole goal of the circulatory and respiratory system is to have this gas exchange happening. So we want to give oxygen to our muscles and get rid of the waste from our body. So oxygen will always move from the alveoli in our lungs into our blood. We're trying to oxygenate our blood. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give some oxygen to our blood so they can drop it off throughout our body. Carbon dioxide, we're going to take that from our blood and then push it out through our mouth. So basically how this works, oxygen moves from lungs to blood. Carbon dioxide moves from blood to lungs. Very important distinction, something I'm 1000% going to ask you about on the test. Okay, and then in a similar vein, get it, similar vein, gas exchange, how that happens. So now we're not talking about the alveoli, we're talking about what the blood actually does. So remember, oxygen has to go from the blood to the body. That's the whole point of oxygen. We're trying to provide some oxygen to our body cells. So it moves from the blood to the body. Carbon dioxide, our body cells use up that oxygen, turn into carbon dioxide. So we're going to take the carbon dioxide from the body cells, put it back into the blood, and then we'll send it all the way back up to our lungs to get exchanged for fresh oxygen once again. So oxygen goes from blood to body, carbon dioxide goes from body to blood. Okay, we probably won't talk too much about fish in this course. We will talk a lot about frogs, and that's because we will be dissecting them on Thursday. So you've probably heard of this, that frogs don't just breathe through lungs, they can also breathe through their skins to help facilitate this gas exchange process. So we're going to be taking a much better look at that obviously on Thursday when we dissect these things and really get into why that happens. But if you take a look here, you might notice that if this is a frog's heart, how many chambers does it, or sorry, not heart, oh it is heart, sorry, frog heart, how many chambers does it really have? And that's a little bit of a kind of trick question, because if you take a look, we have the right atrium, the left atrium, and remember in human we have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Here it only has one ventricle, so it has three chambers: the right atrium, the left atrium, and the one ventricle. So frogs have a three-chambered heart. All right, the rest of this is just about smoking, and I can summarize that by saying please don't smoke. It is so unbelievably terrible for you. It is the most common cause of any respiratory disease and certainly the most avoidable. So do yourself a favor and don't smoke. Look how sad this guy looks. Don't do that. There's no need to do that. Don't do it. Oh, what's that? More things about not smoking? Good. Don't do it. Also, if that wasn't enough for you, this lung paints a pretty good picture. I will also be bringing in a lung next week, or maybe tomorrow. I'll be bringing in a lung tomorrow to show you kind of what smoking does to your lungs over the long term, and compare a healthy lung to a non-healthy lung. So this concludes lesson 8. Please do the practice quizzes, and I will see you tomorrow for our final lesson, lesson 9.